Hello everyone, this will be part 2 of chapter 24 of Regular Boy Daniel Wayne, written by Diamond Rosie and read by Insect Overlord. 10:28 p.m. Father and Daniel returned a lot later than Damien expected they would, though he had little time to spare them outside of dinner. Daniel had seemed too exhausted from the day to entertain any of them, so after dinner everyone had returned back to their own devices. It reminded Damien of a time before Daniel lived with them, when their whole day would be consumed in cases and patrol. Now that Damien had somehow grown unused to it, it felt exhausting. Father was beside himself with worry for Daniel's still mysterious condition, researching how the doctor's theories would interact with his already known and many conditions of the body. Richard and Todd took up looking into the vultures so Father could focus on his matter. Alfred kept a keen eye on Daniel's medications since his initial visit to Dr. Tompkins since his first week at the manor, and was not planning on stopping any time soon. With a list of conditions that Damien was now more familiar with thanks to Drake, he wondered how Daniel could pass for a healthy individual, even despite it all. Father called Damien when it was time to patrol. It continued as usual until Oracle requested Batman on a private line that Robin didn't have access to, resulting in him being quickly handed off to Spoiler without explanation. Later, Oracle alerted them that they were all to return to the cave for the night and disregarded the 2 hours of patrol they had remaining. At the cave, everyone who arrived before was still gathered, examining the image of a frozen house on the big screen. "I didn't know Mr. Freeze was out tonight," Brown commented on the site. "It wasn't Mr. Freeze," Drake said, switching through the camera angles. Damien had never known Mr. Freeze's attacks to be so volatile, even at maximum capacity. At the new angle, Damien recognized the crest as the one of the Drakes, the manor to the left of theirs. The ice did not look naturally formed, with shards pointed jaggedly and haphazardly in every direction in the front gardens, and the actual house was surrounded by crystalline structures of icicles. Damien could see the cold smoke of the ice even through the camera. "Who did you anger this time, Drake?" Damien crossed his arms, not showing his alarm at the clearly targeted attack. Father was the one who answered. It was Danny. "What?" Brown sputtered, as shocked as Damien. "What happened?" Richard asked when no one offered an explanation. "We were going to wait until he woke up to ask," Todd said, arriving from the main house. "Is he okay?" Richard asked, alarmed. "His vitals are fine now. He must have had a panic attack or something," Drake explained, closing the screen with a sigh. Then he passed out. October 29th, Tuesday, 12:09 a.m. Apparently, Daniel had been restless, even unconscious, and refused to leave Todd be. The reason he'd been put to bed in Todd's old room instead of his own. Fortunately, since Damien was not required to attend the academy today by Father, he could monitor Daniel himself. Damien tried to remain courteous of the conversation, and patient until Daniel was done conversing, but Drake seemed to refuse to let him be. "You can come to the lab with me," he began. "I think not, Drake." Damien stepped in before the situation got out of hand. "I imagine Daniel is quite tired of your insistence on permanently being by his side." He frowned at Drake, and Damien was sure he saw relief on Daniel's face. It was only a matter of time before he was sick of Drake anyway. Drake rolled his eyes. "If you want to hang out with him, you know you can just ask, right?" He relented surprisingly easily. Affronted. "We do not hang out. It is training exercise," Damien corrected. "Besides, the doctors were quite clear that Daniel's not to be involved in any strenuous activities, so I suggest you stop straining him with your presence." Drake waved him off uncaringly. "Right." Then to Daniel, "I'll let you know what I find." Once he was finally free from Drake's grasp, Daniel came down to have breakfast, and while Damien had already eaten, he decided to have a snack to keep Daniel company. "Okay, Dames, what do you want to do?" Daniel asked as they walked through the hallway together. "We could go for a round of soccer," he offered. "The weather is really nice outside." Absolutely not. The doctor was quite clear. Damien let his foot stomp on the ground to prove his point and crossed his arms. Daniel looked like he wanted to laugh. Right, I guess they did. Then what should we do? He questioned again. After some back and forth, they decided to explore Drake Manor, since neither of them had seen the site for themselves. Let me go get changed first. They turned toward the stairs, and I should probably clean my room before Alfred has to deal with it. Damien did not outwardly comment that this would be his first time in Daniel's room. The door to Daniel's room was pushed open, and for a moment all Damien could see was the back of Daniel's hand. I'll be right back, he told Damien before disappearing behind the bathroom door. Daniel's room was as large as Damien's, but the added floor made it feel more apartment-like. The room decor was machine-inspired or space-themed. Damien walked to the display case, curiously eyeing the large, varying ships on each level. He wondered how, if they were true brothers that shared the exact same parentage and lineage, they could be so different. Damien had never looked up at the stars and wondered about them, and he'd never been inside a piece of machinery like the watchtower, or their various private jets, and wondered how they worked. He looked closely at each of the trinkets on the glass case. On the second shelf, there was something inside another case, and the machine rotated the object on a display like it was a small planet. Damien watched it reveal itself to him as it orbited the glass case. It was a watch. It was grandfather's watch, the watch that was synonymous with the W insignia woven into the gates of the manor. Damien knew its design as much as he knew its significance, and it made the lip-trembling feeling from the hospital return. He could understand why Father gave it to Daniel. He was the firstborn, the child that, even before his birth, was destined for happiness and love of his mother and father, entirely unlike the vengeance and blood Damien was forged from. When Damien arrived at the manor, he'd been tested. He was tested still, to see just how much of the League puppet he had been made, to see if the claim to his father's lineage was true, and to see if Damien was even worth having as a son. When Daniel arrived, he'd been treated with a delicacy Damien hadn't known existed, much less one that someone like Father could possess. They said it was because he was a civilian, and he wasn't trained to handle the degree of things they had been trained to, that Damien had been trained to. Damien was the son Father had never wanted, and Daniel was the son he never had. Now that he did have him, what use was there for Damien? Daniel was the Wayne who'd never been an Al Ghul, and Damien was the Al Ghul that could never be a Wayne. Damien wondered how far Father's leniency with Daniel would go. When Daniel learned of their identities and wished to join them, would Damien be stripped of Robin for him? Damien was not sure Father had space for both sons, and he was sure that he had much more favor for Daniel than him. When Father would be made to choose, what would become of Damien? Damien could not fault Father for that. Daniel, even as a civilian, showed great physical capabilities. What use was there for a second son when the first was clearly so capable? And what use was there for Damien if he could not protect anyone? It would take at least a few weeks for Daniel's arm to heal, and for every day of those weeks, Damien would have to be reminded of how much of a failure he was. The watch turned away from Damien, as disappointed with him as Father must be. The bathroom door opened with a small click, but Damien could not pull his burning eyes from the sight of the watch. Incredibly aware of the blood under his skin and the air in his lungs. Daniel walked to him, and Damien was expected to say something. His throat felt dry and constricted, and his voice barely managed to squeeze past, "Did Father give you this?" He knew it was delusional to expect an answer other than yes. It was Grandfather's watch, and who else was there to hand it away but Father himself? Daniel turned to the display case, smiling at the memory of it, and it was an answer enough. "That one? Yeah." Damien wasn't sure what his expression looked like then, but it must not have been pleasant. Why? Damien didn't want to linger on the conversation any longer. Let's get going. If Damien could get out of this room, then he would pretend to forget about the watch residing in here. Are you okay, Damien? Damien's stomach twisted with guilt, only marginally less than it burned with an anger so hot that he felt it in his throat. He wasn't sure who he was angry at. Was it Daniel for being the one who'd been given the watch Damien had been trying so hard to earn? Or Father for dismissing Damien so easily once the true firstborn had arrived? Or Mother for allowing Damien to have been born in the first place, knowing that he would be forever only a shadow? Perhaps Damien was mad at himself for far too many reasons to list. He forced his voice even and indifferent. I've noticed you had a sketchbook. Daniel allowed it. Oh, yeah. He went to the desk where it had been laid. That one's pretty old, though. I forgot I left it there. Damien picked it up, forcing his mind to not think about the rotating device behind him. The name Danny Fenton 2020 was inscribed in the front with messy writing. You were younger than me when you had this, Damien realized. For some reason, that fact that he had been once Damien's age and younger shocked him. Daniel seemed amused by this, a look of nostalgia in his face. I guess I was. Damien wondered what Daniel had been like when he had been his age. You can look at it if you want. Damien turned through the pages and pushed past the classification warning on the front. He looked at the various arrays of scribbles on each of the pages, with arrowed notes pointing out things about the contraptions. Damien remembered his own canvas he'd been pouring himself on. Damien never allowed others to see his art, but for some reason he'd been theorizing Daniel's reactions when he'd worked on it. Damien flipped to another page. He wondered if he should let Daniel see it. Would he even care? Would he think it was a waste of time? He did not want to show it to Daniel when Daniel had the watch and Damien didn't. But if Damien still irrationally wanted to show his memory of Alfred's picture, that had to mean Damien wasn't truly angry with Daniel. After all, he didn't even understand what the watch meant, nor had he asked Father for it. If Damien had anger for Daniel, it could not seem to show itself to the brother who'd allowed Damien to see his sketchbook. His heart was still gripped, but at what he wasn't sure. Damien kept turning the pages, trying to gather his courage. I've been working on a painting as well, he only managed to mumble when he realized he'd soon run out of sketches to look at. Really? Are you done with it? Daniel's earnestness was just the response Damien seemed to need. Damien put the book down and wasn't sure what to do with his hands. Would you like to see it? Of course. He said it as if it was the most natural answer. Damien wondered if Daniel would treat him the same if he knew who he really was. Would Daniel still be willing to consider himself Damien's brother if he knew who their mother and grandfather truly were, and who they had made Damien? If he found out Damien was Robin? The walk to Damien's room was both too long and too short. Daniel looked around curiously at the weapons he placed decorating on his walls, in between various paintings. Damien's easel was in the far corner of his room, positioned so it would receive the most sunlight. There were a few warped canvases placed against the wall, and some of Damien's older work placed to dry along with others long forgotten. The piece of their game was still placed on the easel, after Damien's most recent addition of white oil paint to outline the sun's rays. Faced with the image, he suddenly wished Daniel was not standing just steps behind him, but he was already looking at the combination of charcoal and paints, making it far too late for Damien to succumb to his nerves. He knitted his fingers into each other as seconds passed far too slowly. The football nets Damien had set up before their spar were depicted in the foreground, partly hidden behind the bushes and plants of the garden. Neither Daniel nor Damien was in the painting, but the ball could be seen lying closer to one of the nets than the other, and the left side of the painting with the soccer ball was much brighter and sunnier than the right. It was only after he'd added the addition that Damien realized that he had been the one guarding the left net, meaning it was Daniel who had scored in his painting, and not Damien. The gardens were painted with flowers that didn't grow in Gotham's dreary climate. There were small bushels of pink camellias and scattered daylilies. He wasn't sure why he'd picked those, and tried to reflect on the long-forgotten class of the meanings of flowers he'd taken in the League. Daniel looked at the painting, decoded every swipe of the brush like it was a final clue to a case he'd been trying to solve. His injured hand reached for the canvas, the textured paint dragging his fingers. Damien stood by, trying to read Daniel's entirely blank face for some kind of reaction to find what his skills would be appraised to. Daniel turned his head to him like an owl, and Damien was certain there was a momentary twinge of green in his blue eyes. Damien waited for his reaction with a hammering heart. Daniel took a step toward Damien, wrapping his arms around Damien, pulling him into his chest. The moment hadn't been sudden, and Damien had been able to read it as it happened, but it still surprised him. The side of his head rested against the fabric of Daniel's chest without force, and if Damien tried, he could easily pull away. But his body didn't seem to let him, and the heavy feeling residing in his chest since Daniel's accident grew unbearable at the contact. Damien tried to push it away, turning so his face could not be seen, burying it in Daniel's chest. His body seemed not to be able to hold itself together on its own, while dealing with the pressure, forcing his whole weight on Daniel. Damien wasn't sure what was happening, or why the pressure in his chest was not receding, or why breathing was becoming more difficult. "It's okay to miss your mom, Damien." This had nothing to do with Mother, so why was Daniel's say-so? He still held Damien close. Damien's face was wet. He must be sweating. "I promise I won't hate you, and I'm sure that the others don't either." Daniel wanted to tell him that he was wrong, that that wasn't what the painting was all about, and it was about how Damien had scored when Daniel had been least expecting it, and how he'd continued to beat him and become the inheritor of the Wayne name despite him. That was what the painting was about. Daniel was even more wrong because he could not possibly go his whole life without hating Damien. Everyone that met Damien hated him. Hate was the easiest thing that people felt when it came to Damien. So if Daniel didn't hate him now, he'd hate him eventually. Despite having always known this, the thought suddenly terrified Damien. He did not want Daniel to hate him. Not now, and especially not later, but it would be inevitable. He felt himself be pushed into Daniel's chest harder. It wasn't until he felt the small flinch of an injured arm that Damien realized he was the one gripping onto Daniel like his life depended on it. Maybe it did. Someone was crying. There were rib-shaking sobs, and it sounded like they had to fight to get the air back in their lungs before it was forced out again. "It's okay, Damien." Daniel's voice was calm and gentle as he patted Damien's head soothingly, while his injured arm lay heavy and comforting on his back. Was Damien the one crying? Damien wasn't supposed to cry. He was Robin, and he would be the next Batman. He had to be strong and brave so he could protect everyone, and he couldn't do that if he cried, but he couldn't make himself stop until the tears dried up on their own. Daniel stayed as he was until Damien pulled himself back, immediately missing the smell of his shirt and the hand in his hair. Maybe Damien did miss Mother. Daniel said again, "I promise I don't hate you, Damien." Damien really wanted to believe him. "I'm sure we can talk with Bruce about you seeing your mom again." He wiped Damien's face dry with one hand, "even if she lives far." Damien didn't like how his brothers spoke as if they didn't share a mother. Clearly because Daniel, on top of never meeting Mother, knew nothing about her thanks to Father's insistence. "Maybe you can go visit her," he offered. "That's probably not a good idea," Damien snarked, hoping it didn't sound too harsh. If Daniel asked why, Damien wasn't sure what lie he should spew. If Daniel asked, Damien wouldn't lie. "Oh, okay." Damien could see him calculating that information into what little else he knew about Mother. "Do you still want to go to Drake Manor?" 1:26 p.m. The walk between the gates of Wayne Manor and Drake Manor was a long one, a travel better suited for car or something of the like. On the long walk, Daniel didn't ask Damien why he'd cried like an unintelligent child, or scold him for holding onto his already injured arm when it was Damien's fault it was injured in the first place. He asked Damien what medium was his favorite, and when he couldn't decide, he asked what he liked about each one. He asked if Damien had a favorite piece, and he said he didn't, even though it was the one he showed Daniel. The warm sun felt refreshing on Damien's sore eyes, a contrast to Daniel's cold touch in the warm embrace. As they walked, Damien could not shake the feeling of secondary eyes on him. He felt silly for feeling hopeful it was Mother, and he might be able to spy her green eyes between the foliage on the roadside. Damien was certain they had not been watched the whole walk, just the later portion after they entered the area of Drake's property. He tried to stay vigilant on the matter, since there were many others besides just Mother who it could be. The thought on the matter was immediately forgotten when they reached the gate of Drake Manor. They were frozen wide open, and at the sight, Daniel's questioning on Damien's art process came to an abrupt stop. Damien was glad he'd come to see it on his own, rather than simply trusting the security footage. Here he could see the pattern of the ice had formed in, like crystals that had built upon each other. The smoke of the harsh temperature that had been visible last night hadn't quelled even under the light of the sun. The hand Damien had tried to trace over a particularly large shard encasing the gate flinched back from the burning chill before it made contact. He'd never seen ice so cold or so much. According to Father and the other two, he'd passed out from the theorized panic attack and not from power overuse, meaning if Daniel had been in a more emotionally stable state, he could have continued. The incident happened over 14 hours ago, and the ice had not even cooled, much less melted. It had to be only by its own merit, since the weather was not yet cold enough to support even light snow that was common in Gotham's later autumn. Nothing about the ice was natural. It formed in layers so clear every layer of its formation was visible until the concentration became too much to distinguish. The best of the icicles grew larger, and even the generously sized Drake Manor that spread wide enough it touched all four walls of the wealthy property. When Damien turned to Daniel, he was expecting him to be just as awestruck as Damien was at the raw power that had come forth, impressed by his own fortitude despite the lack of formal training. Daniel looked horrified. "I did that?" he whispered, his voice devoid of unending calm reassurance it had supplied Damien with. Daniel's hands were shaking at his side, and Damien couldn't understand why. Damien tried to step onto the property, but his footwear had not been chosen with the forethought of having to walk through a tundra, and he found himself on the floor. Before even making it past the gates, Damien's breath began to fog, and his skin stung with the cold. The ice began receding, melting into itself far quicker than Damien would expect of ice that had remained unshaken for so long. Daniel walked through the main door, the ice clearing away to expose the original foliage at the spot of each footfall. Damien followed behind his brother, making sure his feet only landed where Daniel had cleared a path. The foliage that had been under the smoky frost looked just as healthy as the unfrozen plants at Wayne Manor. Mr. Freeze's freeze ray, while only fractionally as powerful as Daniel's ice had proven to be, could not manage to bring back to life the plants it decimated, much to Poison Ivy's ire. Daniel hesitated at the door, waiting for the hinges to unfreeze before he pushed it open. "Where are we going?" Damien asked him about the clearly targeted path. Daniel didn't answer him, and Damien made sure to keep in step behind his brother. The ice inside the manor looked even more intricately woven. In some places there were sporadic icicles like those that overtook the estate outside, and in others there were swirls of ice growing on the wall and stair lining, with the uniqueness snowflakes were rumored to possess. The ice had encased everything, like it had always been there, painting a clear path Daniel and Drake must have taken. The ice, in the places it receded, didn't seem to have damaged the property any more than neglect had, displaying that Daniel was more powerful than Damien had originally assumed. They took the stairs to the 3rd floor, where the hallway took a curvature to accommodate the ballroom they passed earlier. On it were portraits of people with names Damien didn't recognize since he was unfamiliar with the Drake's family tree. One of the portraits sat tilted by the spike of ice that had not attended the others. Near the floor, under the painting, was a handprint depressed in the rest of the ice. Daniel bent down to examine it. His hand perfectly fit the mold. "Do you want to look around?" Despite it being phrased as a question, Damien could clearly see Daniel's dread of the place in its condition. "No," Damien shrugged, making himself bored and uninterested. Drake Manor was back to its neglected state by the time they reached the front gates. The walk back was silent and quick. Later, when Drake called Daniel down to his lab, Damien did not intercede, instead going to the cave to continue researching on his case. Today was one of the rare days when Father would remain off patrol to watch Daniel, and Damien was surprised when he heard him enter the cave. He confessed that he and Daniel had fought, and that Daniel had been the one that managed to injure his face. Then he confessed that Daniel knew who was behind the vultures, but refused to tell Father. "He doesn't think we can do anything about it," Father said. Damien thought that was strange behavior, and not something he would have expected of Daniel. Drake was the one to offer. "Don't you think we should tell him? About us being the bats and everything?" Father was not keen on discussing it for longer, and dismissed Damien to watch Daniel. Damien understood why the others wanted Daniel to know about their secret identities more than he did. Father insisted that they don't. Still, Damien agreed with him. He didn't want Daniel to know about that he was Robin to preserve the image Damien had that Robin could not uphold after his blunder. Damien forced his way upstairs, unsure what kind of terror he'd see in Daniel's eyes this time. Damien knocked on Daniel's door. There was no answer. It was hardly past 10. He couldn't have gone to sleep yet. Damien knocked again. "Daniel?" he called through the door. Damien tried to reason away the feeling in his gut that something horrible had happened, only now recalling the eyes he'd felt earlier. He'd left all his weapons downstairs, and there was nothing he could use to defend himself or Daniel if something were to go wrong. Damien reconsidered. If someone had attempted to try and get past the manor gates without prior access, then the security system would have been alerted. Damien turned the handle to the room carefully to reveal a dark room. There was someone on the bed, covered under the blanket. Daniel must have gone to bed, Damien reasoned. Closing the door silently, Damien went to his room, not wanting to know the argument that had probably only festered more in his absence. Father would likely not allow him back to patrol. As he entered the room, the hair on the back of his neck went rigid. There was someone there, but Damien couldn't see them. He made a quick action for the spear on the wall closest to him, but his hands were caught halfway through the motion. The fingers that held his arms were long and slim, belonging to a figure less than a foot taller than him, and long black hair dangled in his periphery, wafting to the scent of the specific jasmine flower that only grew in Nanda Parbat. "You've grown sloppy, Damien." Despite the danger he knew he was in, Damien's chest warmed at the voice. "Mother, what are you doing here?" Damien tried to sound as she would expect him, confident, sure, and unshaken. "In due time, my dear." In a swift motion, she turned Damien so he was facing her, keeping his hands restricted, while pushing a scented cloth over his mouth and nose. Damien had barely made out the greens of her eyes or the olive of her complexion before his vision grew blurry. He tried to resist, but there was nothing more he could do than thrash ineffectively against her hold, and try to think of a plan. But he was too far gone already. The next time Damien had any semblance of awareness, he was in a moving vehicle. His chest was bound on a plush seat, but his hands and legs were free. Damien looked down at his restraint to find it was only a seatbelt. His eyesight took a moment to clear up, and he saw Mother sitting opposite of him, dressed in traditional League attire. Taking in the scene, he concluded they were in a jet. Mother was facing him, but when she noticed Damien was awake, her eyes shifted to see him. She hadn't been looking at Damien. Curious to know what got her attention, Damien turned to where his gaze had been. In the seat next to him, Daniels was still unconscious and completely unaware. Damien's mind raced, trying to understand what just happened. "It's good to see you as well, Damien," Mother said, wearing a smile that now reminded him of Daniel. "I've missed you." "You kidnapped us," Damien stated. "It was to avoid your father for the time being. I am quite cross with him." Mother sipped at the drink a servant brought her. "He could not even find a moment to inform me of your brother?" Her eyes moved from Damien to Daniel, and she tried to memorize his features. Damien wasn't sure what he was supposed to say, so he said nothing. "Your brother was injured under your father's care. Has he managed to find the culprit yet?" She didn't ask how it happened, which meant she knew. "He hasn't found anything substantial yet." Damien hesitated, casting a look at Mother to gauge if he should say more. Mother caught it and turned toward him attentively. "What is on your mind?" "Daniel said he knows who it was." He breathed out, hoping he wasn't making the wrong move by telling her. Damien thought over and over how Mother might react to discovering Daniel was alive, but he'd never come up with a believable answer for himself. "Then your father must be working on a plan as we speak." She nodded in satisfaction, turning to look out the dark windows. "He hasn't told Father." If Mother was planning on hurting Daniel, this should bar any punishments for the time being. If Father hadn't made a plan to have the vultures dealt with, then Mother would do it herself. And that would require she acquire Daniel's good favor. Mother seemed intrigued by this, turning to Daniel as if she could expected him to explain himself. Since clearly he could not, she asked Damien and said, "Why not?" Damien's eyes slithered away from Mother to check if Daniel had stirred or showed any signs of being awake, before he answered. That seemed to be answer enough. "Oh?" Mother hummed, intrigued, keeping her eyes on the older of the two boys. "I'm not the only one your father decided to hide things from, then." She took another sip. "How come I'm awake but Daniel's not?" "He won't wake up until we land in Nanda Parbat. It would do no one well if he concluded I was a threat while we were in the air." Mother found that conclusion endearing. Then more candidly, "I would like to make a good first impression." Damien realized she had seen the state of Drake Manor before it was thawed. Moments passed with no more conversation left to have, and a servant came to ask if Damien would like food. He declined, not trusting himself to be able to stomach it. Suddenly, the plane turned, and the drink in Mother's glass shook enough that a few drops splattered on her dress. Daniel's head, while he was still unconscious and unable to brace himself, hung limply on with his neck unsupported. Placing her drink on the table between them, Mother leaned over to help Daniel to a much more comfortable position. Then she had a servant send sharp words to the pilot about what may become of him should that mistake be repeated. "Mother?" "Yes, dear?" Taking a breath of courage, "Why did you never tell me that I had a brother?" Mother's face turned as close to apologetic as Damien had ever seen it. She pushed his hair away from his forehead, with the same delicacy she had fixed Daniel's head. "I did not want you to think me a coward, but in the process I have made myself one." She whispered to him in the Arabic he hadn't heard in 3 years since he had become a Wayne. It was not an apology, but it was the only kind Mother would give. Damien didn't understand how Mother could ever be made scared enough to succumb to cowardice, and he knew better than to ask. "Night is upon you. Embrace it before the day takes it away," she said, cradling the side of Damien's face as she'd done when he was a restless child. This concludes the second and final part of Chapter 24 of Regular Boy Daniel Wayne. I hope you enjoyed. That's it for now. Thank you so much for listening.